prefixed to the edition of 1758.1 by Jonathan Swift. Footnote 1. This advertisement was written by the editor, Dr. Charles Lucas of Dublin. This Lucas was the patriot who created such a stir in Irish politics between the years 1743 and 1750. Lord Townshend, in a letter to the Marquis of Granby, called him the Wilkes of Ireland. As an author, he seems to have been very prolific, though of no polish in his writings. Lucas's disclaimers of sympathy with the opinions contained in the work he edited are somewhat overstated, and his criticisms are petty. A full account of this hot-headed physician may be found in the Dictionary of National Biography. It was Dr. Johnson, in his Life of Swift, who first published the information that Lucas edited this history. T.S. Thus, the long-wished-for history of the 4 last years of the Queen's reign is at length brought to light, in spite of all attempts to suppress it. As this publication is not made under the sanction of the name or names which the author and the world had a right to expect, it is fit some account of the works appearing in this manner should be here given. Long before the Dean's apparent decline, some of his intimate friends, with concern, foresaw the impending fate of his fortune and his works. To this it is owing that these sheets, which the world now despaired of ever seeing, are rescued from obscurity, perhaps from destruction. For this, the public is indebted to a gentleman, now in Ireland, of the greatest probity and worth, with whom the Dean long lived in perfect intimacy. To this gentleman's hands, the Dean entrusted a copy of his history, desiring him to peruse and give his judgment of it, with the last corrections and amendments the author had given it, in his own hand. His friend read, admired, and approved, and from a dread of so valuable and so interesting a work's being by any accident lost or effaced, as was probable by its not being intended to be published in the author's lifetime, he resolved to keep this copy till the author should press him for it, but with a determined purpose it should never see the light, while there was any hopes of the author's own copy being published or even preserved. This resolution he inviolably kept, till he and the world had full assurance that the Dean's executors, or those into whose hands the original copy fell, were so far from intending to publish it, that it was actually suppressed, perhaps destroyed. Then he thought himself not only at liberty, but judged it his duty to his departed friend, and to the public, to let this copy, which he had now kept many years most secretly, see the light. Thus it has at length fallen into the hands of a person who publishes it for the satisfaction of the public, abstracted from all private regards, which are never to be permitted to come in competition with the common good. Every judicious eye will see that the author of these sheets wrote with strong passions, but with stronger prepossessions and prejudices in favor of a party. These, it may be imagined, the editor in some measure may have adopted, and published this work as a kind of support of that party, or some surviving remnant thereof. It is but just to undeceive the reader, and inform him from what kind of hand he has received this work. A man may regard a good piece of painting, while he despises the subject. If the subject be ever so despicable, the masterly strokes of the painter may demand our admiration, while he, in other respects, is entitled to no portion of our regard. In poetry we carry our admiration still farther, and like the poet, while we actually contemn the man. Historians share the like fate, hence some, who have no regard to propriety or truth, are yet admired for diction, style, manner, and the like. The editor considers this work in another light. He long knew the author, and was no stranger to his politics, connections, tendencies, passions, and the whole economy of his life. He has long been heartily singular in condemning this great man's conduct amid the admiring multitude, nor ever could have thought of making an interest in a man, whose principles and manners he could by no rule of reason or honor approve, however he might have admired his parts and wit. Such was judged the disposition of the man, whose history of the most interesting period of time in the annals of Britain are now, herein, offered to the reader. He may well ask from what motives. The answer is easily, simply given. The causes assigned for delaying the publication of this history were principally these: 2. That the manuscript fell into the hands of men, who, whatever they might have been by the generality deemed, were by the dean believed to be of his party, though they did not, after his death, judge it prudent to avow his principles, more than to deny them in his lifetime. These men, having got their beavers, tobacco boxes, and other trifling remembrances of former friendship, by the dean's will, did not choose publicly to avow principles that had marred their friend's promotion and might probably put a stop to theirs. Therefore, they gave the inquisitive world to understand that there was something too strong against many great men, as well as the succeeding system of public affairs in general, in the Dean's history of the 4 last years of the Queen's reign, to admit of a publication in our times, and with this poor insinuation excused themselves and satisfied the weakly well-affected in suppressing the manifestation of displeasing truths of however great importance to society. Footnote 2. The causes for the delay in the publication of the history are given at length by the present editor in the introduction. T.S. This manuscript has now fallen into the hands of a man who never could associate with or even approve any of the parties or factions that have differently distracted, it might be said disgraced, these kingdoms, because he has as yet known none, whose motives or rules of action were truth and the public good alone, of one who judges that perjured magistrates of all denominations and their most exalted minions may be exposed, deprived, or cut off by the fundamental laws of his country, and who, upon these principles, from his heart approves and glories in the virtues of his predecessors, who revived the true spirit of the British polity in laying aside a pre-stridden and henpecked tyrannical tool who had overturned the political constitution of his country, and in reinstituting the dissolved body politic by a revolution supported by the laws of nature and the realm, as the only means of preserving the natural and legal, the civil and religious liberties of the members of the Commonwealth. Truth in this man's estimation can hurt no good cause, and falsehood and fraud in religion and politics are ever to be detected, to be exploded. Insinuations that this history contained something injurious to the present establishment, and therefore necessary to be suppressed, serve better the purposes of mistaken or insidious malcontents than the real publication can. And if anything were by this or any other history to be shown essentially erroneous in our politics, who that calls himself a Briton can be deemed such an impious slave as to conceal the destructive evil, the editor of this work disdains and abhors the servile thought, and wishes to live no longer than he dares to think, speak, write, and in all things to act worthy of a Briton. From this regard to truth and to his country, the editor of this history was glad of an opportunity of rescuing such a writing from those who meant to suppress it. The common cause, in his estimation, required and demanded it should be done, and the sooner it is published, he judged, the better. For if the conduct of the Queen and her ministers does not deserve the obloquy that has been long industriously cast upon it, what is more just than to vindicate it? What more reasonable than that this should be done, while living witnesses may yet be called, to prove or disprove the several allegations and assertions, since, in a few years more, such witnesses may be as much wanting as to prevent a canonization, which is therefore prudently procrastinated for above an age. Let us then coolly hear what is to be said on this side the question, and judge like Britons. The editor would not be thought to justify the author of this history in all points, or even to attempt to acquit him of unbecoming prejudices and partiality. Without being deeply versed in history or politics, he can see his author, in many instances, blinded with passions that disgrace the historian, and blending, with phrases worthy of a Caesar or a Cicero, expressions not to be justified by truth, reason, or common sense, yet think him a most powerful orator and a great historian. No unprejudiced person will blame the Dean for doing all that is consistent with truth and decency to vindicate the government of the Queen, and to exculpate the conduct of her ministers and her last general. All good men would rejoice at such a vindication. But if he meant no more than this, his work would ill deserve the title of an history, that he generally tells truths and founds his most material assertions upon fact, will, I think, be found very evident. But there is room to suspect that, while he tells no more than the truth, he does not tell the whole truth. However, he makes it very clear that the Queen's allies, especially our worthy friends the Dutch, were much to blame for the now generally condemned conduct of the Queen, with regard to the prosecution of the war and the bringing about the peace. The author's drawings of characters are confessedly partial, for he tells us openly he means not to give characters entire, but such parts of each man's particular passions, acquirements, and habits, as he was most likely to transfer into his political schemes. What writing, what sentence, what character can stand this torture? What extreme perversion may not, let me say, does not this produce? Yet thus does he choose to treat all men that were not favourers of the latest measures of the Queen, when the best that has been said for her shows no more than that she was blindfolded and held in leading strings by her ministers. He does not spare a man, confessed by all the world to have discharged the duties of his function like a soldier, like an hero, but charges Prince Eugene with raising and keeping up a most horrible mob, with intent to assassinate Harley. For all which odious charges he offers not one individual point of proof. He is not content with laying open again the many faults already publicly proved upon the late Duke of Marlborough, but insinuates a new crime by seeming to attempt to acquit him of aspiring at the throne. But this is done in a manner peculiar to this author. On the other hand, he extols the ministers and minions of the Queen in the highest terms, and while he robs their antagonists of every good quality, generally gives those wisdom and every virtue that can adorn human nature. He is not ashamed to attempt to justify what all thinking good men must condemn, the Queen's making 12 peers at once to serve a particular turn. All these may be ascribed to the strength of his passions and to the prejudices early imbibed in favor of his indulgent royal mistress and her favorites and servants. 3. The judicious will look through the elegant clothing and dispassionately consider these as mere human errors, to which no well-informed mind can assent. The editor thinks himself bound to protest against them. Footnote 3. That Swift should have a strong partiality to Harley and St. John, by whom he was respected and trusted to a most uncommon degree, is natural and obvious, but upon what ground Queen Anne, who disliked his person and obstructed his preferment, is here termed his indulgent mistress, the author of this preface ought to have condescended to explain. He makes a few lapses on the other side, without being as clear as an impartial historian would choose to appear. He more than hints at the Queen's displeasure at its being moved in Parliament, that the Prince-Elector should be invited to reside in England, to whose crown he was by law declared presumptive heir, but is always open upon the Queen's insisting on the pretenders being sent out of France. It is easy to see how incompatible these things appear. Nothing could tend more to secure the Hanover succession and to enlarge its benefits to Britain than the bringing over the successor, who should, in every country, be well instructed in the language, customs, manners, religion, and laws of his future subjects, before he comes to hold the reins of government. And our author does not take the proper care to inform us how far the French thought fit to comply with banishing the pretender their dominions, since many still live in doubt that if he was sent out of France, he was sent into England. But there is one expression of our author too perverse, too grossly abused, to admit of any apology, of any palliation. It is not to be supposed that he was ignorant of any word in the English language, and least of all can he be supposed ignorant of the meaning of a word, which, had it been ever so doubtful before, had a certain meaning impressed upon it by the authority of Parliament, of which no sensible subject can be ignorant. Notwithstanding this, where our author speaks of the late King James, he calls him the abdicated king, and gives the same epithet even to his family. Though this weak, ill-advised, and ill-fated prince, in every sense of the word, with Romans and English, and to all intents and purposes abdicated, yet can he in no sense be called abdicated, unless the people's asserting their rights and defending themselves against a king who broke his compact with his subjects and overturned their government can be called abdication in them, which no man in his senses can be hardy enough to support upon any principle of reason or the laws of England. Let the reader judge which this is most likely to be, error or design. These exceptions the editor thought himself bound to make to some parts of this work, to keep clear of the disagreeable imputations of being of a party, of whatsoever denomination, in opposition to truth and the rights and liberties of the subject. These laid aside, the work will be found to have many beauties, many excellencies. Some have of late affected to depreciate this history from an insinuation made only since the author's death, to wit, that he was never admitted into the secrets of the administration, but made to believe he was a confidant, only to engage him in the list of the ministerial writers of that reign. The falsehood of this will readily appear upon perusal of the work. This shows he knew the most secret springs of every movement in the whole complicated machine, that he states facts, too well known to be contested, in elegant simplicity, and reasons upon them with the talents of the greatest historian, and thus makes an history, composed rather of negotiations than actions, most entertaining, affecting, and interesting, instead of being, as might be expected, heavy, dull, and disagreeable. It is now fit to apologize for some errors, which the judicious must discover upon a perusal of this work. It is for this, among other reasons, much to be lamented, that this history was not published under the author's own inspection. It is next to impossible to copy or print any work without faults, and most so where the author's eye is wanting. It is not to be imagined that even our author, however accurate, however great, was yet strictly and perfectly correct in his writings. Yet where some seeming inaccuracies in style or expression have been discovered, the deference due to the author made any alteration too presumptuous a task for the editor. These are therefore left to the amending hand of every sensible and polite reader, while the editor hopes it will suffice that he should point out some of those errors which are to be ascribed either to transcribers or the press, and which may be rectified in the manner following in reading the work. 4. And thus, with these and perhaps some few such like corrections, it is hoped this work will be found completely correct.